Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Ask the Analyst session for the Talent and People Success 9 Grid. I'm John Kennard, Content Editor at Fosway Group, Europe's #1 HR industry analyst. I'm your host for today's session. Founded in 1996, Fosway Group provides in-depth corporate research on next-gen HR talent and learning practices. We provide analyst and advisory services to more than 3,000 European and international headquartered multinationals and corporates, as well as independent vendor research and EMEA market commentary. Before we get into it, though, I do need to talk about Fosway Corporate Membership. This is a private network for corporate HR learning and talent leaders, offering deeper access to data and insights behind the 9 grids and realities, monthly virtual roundtables on key topics, private analyst time, and accelerated buying support. There's much more besides this, so please do get in touch afterwards if you're interested in learning more. The research in this report shows a challenging economy is making for cautious talent solutions market, pushing HR teams to reduce costs. And yet many skills and workforce intelligence solutions are reporting strong growth. There is plenty of opportunity here for innovation still. So I am delighted to welcome lead analyst on this research and Fosway Chief Insights Officer David Perring, as well as Fosway CEO and founder David Wilson, to discuss all the findings from the latest iteration of this particular 9 grid. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. Please ask questions throughout. Use the chat. We will ask these at the end. If it makes sense in flow, then I'll ask them then, but we'll gather most of them up for an extensive Q&A session towards the end. So with that, it's for me to hand over to David Wilson to set the scene. David.
Hi, and good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are from me too. Just like to start off before we actually go into the 9 grid itself with just a sort of few preamble slides, really, just to remind you where all the data comes from. As you know, the 9 grids we publish annually, but the process is an all year round process, as well as obviously a whole heap of activity as we get towards the end. It's a bit like, and the 9 grid itself is a bit of a tip of an iceberg. So you see, everybody sees the image and asks questions around that, but mostly there's a huge amount of work goes behind it. The main sources of that, obviously, from our corporate research network, corporate inquiries, and private advisory work that we do. We do a lot of public research, as many of you are aware, as well. And then there's a fairly deep structured process for engaging around the leading up to each 9 grid, including structured data capture from the vendors with functional, non-functional data, lots of independent briefings, demonstrations, user conference events, and so on, and things like this, plus a formal customer referencing process. So it's a bit of a monster. And obviously we're running this and putting it together with other data that we capture all throughout the year. One of the questions we get quite asked frequently is who is included in 9 grid and how, why. So the main criteria around this are basically the options and that are in use or being considered by our corporate readership audience, particularly our corporate research network. So those are in active use or in active consideration in some kind, maybe around a buying process, or come up in some of the innovative conversations we have with them. And then from a Fosway point of view, we believe they have the potential to serve that audience. So it's very much aimed at a kind of enterprise organization. It's not a pay-for-play environment. Vendors can't buy their way onto a 9 grid. They also can't decline to be on there or buy their way off of a 9 grid either. So it's very much the inclusion is very much determined by the analyst and who they think is relevant to that target audience. Although obviously there's a very extensive vendor process as part of it, in many ways that vendor input's secondary part of the process. Obviously the most important view from ours is what customers say about vendors and their experiences of them and how they perform, and maybe how they're changing the way they think about them within their ecosystem. The vendor input's really important as well, because it gives us a way of cross-validating assumptions around this, and also helps us to deepen insights about areas that maybe don't come through direct from customers, plus obviously to talk to them about future roadmap and customer wins and all those kinds of things as well. So there's a huge amount of data that gets analyzed each time. And at the end of the day, it's lots of kind of hard data as well as qualitative data we're putting together, as well as helping to try and validate that from all sides and come up with an analysis we think is representative of the output. The final comment I'll make before I hand over to David is although everybody kind of looks at the 9 grid as an image, in reality it's much more than that. It's certainly there's a detailed report that comes out of it, including a lot of the market and solution trends associated with that. That's really important as well, and I would certainly recommend you read and download the reports, because the trends tell you how we're looking at the market as a whole, and also how we're assessing vendors, particularly in terms of potential and so on. And because the analysis is zero-based each year, a vendor can, might do quite a lot of stuff, but still get out innovated by the wider market and almost go backwards in the rating and so on as well. So we constantly are updating the assessment process, and as I said, gathering completely new data on which to continue to assess it. So on that note, I think I'll hand over to David to talk specifically around talent and people success.
Thanks, David. So what I thought I'd do is just paint a wider picture of how talent people success fits within our wider cloud HR HCM solution model. And I thought this was just a useful thing to drop in to help you understand that when we're doing this profile of the market, whilst we do only share the 30, 45 providers, which is focused on talent people success on the actual TPS grid, actually we're able to benchmark that across 60 plus providers who also encompass cloud HR, because we use a subset of the cloud HR data profiling as part of our activity. So when we look at this segment, what we're really doing is comparing all the things that are in orange and the light blue and the dark blue and the green and the gray as being almost a subset of the overall cloud HR model. And the only things that almost get excluded from the model when we go into talent people success is payroll, service delivery, and some elements of workforce. But even that start increasingly stretching into this segment as well. So it's really quite a broad sense of the people experience, encompassing things like talent acquisition, learning performance, skills, the whole gamut through recognition and reward and employee engagement, in listening, well-being. All of that forms part of the talent and people success ecosystem. And in some ways, you can probably think of those elements as being things that are transformative around HR rather than necessarily just transactional, and maybe turn HR from being a solution or an environment which is a system of record into systems of enablement. And that means that actually when we're comparing this segment, there's quite a few specialists, because that's a point of differentiation across the employee experience that many large enterprises want to buy into. So John, if we skip on to the next slide. What I also like to do is just spend a couple of minutes just reiterating the sort of longevity of us looking at this segment. We started profiling this way back, probably at the end of the noughties, so to speak, in terms of the late 2000s, in terms of 2008, 2009, really with SuccessFactors starting to establish this category and then watching people like Cornerstone step into it. We published our first grid in, I think it was about 2013, 2014, having looked at this particular segment for quite a long time. And what we've done is we've taken that definition from being about talent management, which is really what you see in the blue text on the left-hand side. And in 2018, we sort of pivoted that to say, well, actually, there's more to these solutions in terms of what they're doing than purely managing HR processes. They're starting to be much more about employee and manager enablement and changing some of their philosophies. And again, we're picking out some of these as an example, and some of these are quite useful even with the evolution of AI in the workforce, for example, about workforce planning. That has changed maybe from being a long-term cycle of what people do need in 6 months' time into being maybe agile talent allocation. And even that definition around what talent is has shifted a little bit from being about our internal employees and our full-time and part-time workers to being our partners and the extended enterprise, and probably in the last 2 years, AI as a resource. So when we talk about talent acquisition flexing its way into flexible resourcing, actually that means to some extent more than just managing talent and people success. To some extent, we maybe need to change the definition a little bit and talk about talent, people success, and workforce success, because the workforce is something more than just people now. And that is shaping the evolution of what it means to organize gigs and workplace. It's about how we think about skills and projects. Lots of these things are starting to evolve very quickly. And I think we did a really good job back in about 2018 when we did this redefinition to almost herald this sort of shift in philosophy that also HR teams are going through, which we'll uncover a little bit in other research. But it's worth just sort of thinking about some of these things, what it means about flexible working rather than just compensation and benefits, thinking about employee assistance. We used to have a telephone number, to thinking about how do I support wellness and well-being, etc. So there's loads of things down there I think it's worth picking out. But what I will do is pick out one of the ones at the bottom about competency and capability management. This whole movement to skills-based organizations, skills inferences, and almost starting to harness total talent insight is quite a significant shift, both across talent and people success, but also the wider HR environment as well. And actually, I think that is a really good touchstone to come back to. So we move on to the next slide, really, about that sense of total people insight. I think we've got this historical view potentially of HR data just being transactional data around performance. Maybe it's just transactional data about what job you're in, how much you're getting paid. But increasingly having a total view of people's engagement, the ability and readiness of people to step into new roles because of changing organization is becoming part of a total people insight strategy, and seeing HR leaders to some extent becoming more intelligence-led. So moving on, that's just a little bit of background. I think it's useful to get that sense. But again, this is a tough thing for me to do, right? I get asked to pick out 4 trends out of the 28 that are in the report. So I do smart still, because there's so many things to talk about around this particular segment. And I will try my best to try and pick out a few. But these were the ones that I think sort of stood out. And I'll try my best to link 7 other items to them, but I'm not sure if I've got time to do that. But just to start off there, so AI, I think in terms of the headlines around the grid more broadly, it is changing the employee experience for good. It really is transforming the employee experience, the manager experience, in ways that we probably would not have thought possible 15 years ago. It really has transformed things. And if I pick out 2 particular strands, I will come back to that skills-based organization and where that's going. I think from an organizational point of view, is it possible to execute skills-based organizations with the speed, the flexibility, and the ongoing refresh of those skills without AI? I just don't see how that works. In the past, maybe 15 years ago, it would take you a year to define skills ontology, and even by then it'd be out of date. Now that happens in hours and days, probably hours, more like hours than it has done in the past. And that is changing how organizations are able to help people understand what development needs they have. It's helping organizations understand how they can align those people into particular types of work. It enables them to signal to people the skills that are trending in a negative way in terms of their value and employability, and also signal those skills that are trending in a positive way. It's helping organizations understand to some extent or make predictions about the future of work, because certain tasks are starting to become automated by AI, and that changes the nature of work. And then that has knock-on effects to the skills, either upskilling required or de-skilling, where that skills may be less important as a result of the introduction of AI. And that changes the nature of the workforce. So all these, even just around skills, that's having a massive ripple through in terms of the experiences that we can offer people, but also the offer around the business agility that it also enables the organization to make, and maybe the strategic decision making it can make. So that's just on the skills side. If I think about how AI is changing performance and employee listening and the ability to drive higher quality management, all of the unstructured data that you can now acquire through an employee listening program used to take 3 or 4 months just to try and plow your way through to create a report. We're now in a place where AI chatbots can interpret the data and start to develop managers in the skills, the behaviors that would make them a more effective manager in their context based on the feedback and engagement of their people. That is not something we used to be able to do. And this is having a transformative effect on the ability of managers to be better managers and people to become more engaged. So those are just 2 strands, but I think it's a really significant sense of these things were not possible without AI. And to some extent, if I think go back to skills, and I know Michael's on here from Eightfold, that is something they've been doing for the last 8-9 years. So this is AI that has maybe been in play for a long time. It's well established, and that's I think a significant sort of part of the story. And maybe that's another part of the story overall is, of all the areas where there seems to be the most developed AI, it is around skills, it is around processing that unstructured data from employee listing, which are probably the most developed, and talent acquisition as well, if I pick that out. But overall, there is some really important things in there. And I think I'll come back to that future of work. The nature of the future of work is starting to disrupt organizations. We'll touch on this a little bit later around strategic workforce, but just to say strategic workforce planning is the #1 HR initiative for 2026 when we looked at our latest HR realities. And it's there because AI is disrupting work. I spoke a few seconds ago about the nature of that in terms of AI takes away tasks, and in taking away tasks, that restructures skills. And I think what we've seen, probably lots of the providers who've got skills focus, what they've seen them do is they've started to pivot away from skills just per se into a more granular view of capability in the organization, including tasks, to help organizations understand what tasks are going to be fully automated, which ones are augmented, what tasks are still done by people. And that is helping shape the future workforce. So I think there is a trend here around going to a more granular view, and the AI is driving that, but also taking a more task-orientated view. And if you've taken a skills-based view of your workforce, I think that has a little bit of a shelf life in terms of just being a pure play around skills. There is something that is evolving, which is more detailed and task-led. Other things, just in terms of and maybe this is linked to skills in a way, the cloud HCM is now disrupting the disruptors. And what we mean by that is actually there's probably 2 forces at play here. One is the pressure around HR budgets. 35% in our latest HR realities survey show or report that they've got increased pressure to consolidate their HR platforms. And that is driving some behaviors and maybe some stagnation in the market that we've not seen before. But equally, there are some things, say, around the development and management of skills ontologies, which is becoming less differentiating because it has been around for the last 7-8 years on scale and being used live in organizations. So as cloud HR providers start to envelop maybe more established AI scenarios, what that is doing is starting to squeeze particular providers who may have been leaders in the talent and people success space out of a secure foothold in the organizations. CTOs and CFOs are saying, why have we got 2 platforms which manage skills? Why have we got 2 platforms, be that a Workday or an Oracle, which are doing talent acquisition on top of our smart recruiters, which you may have had. So there is an element of convergence that is being sort of felt in the industry. But I still go back, I think, and maybe this is one of the reasons that we focus so much on this as a classification as talent and people success, is the cloud HR platforms are still struggling to some extent to reach the levels of quality or the level of functional richness that the specialists in this domain have. And that still is maybe a counterforce against the disruption, the consolidation of providers. But that's something that we're seeing more broadly. It is, I think, an interesting challenge for anyone on this particular grid to have a sufficiently differentiated experience, have good tie-ins to external business data to show why they are effective, and try and take away the pressure of consolidation, which is where that cloud HCM is disrupting the disruptors. And finally, just around the strategic workforce intelligence, I think there's something within the broader AI story and just the HR story overall, which is pushing it to be much more intelligence-led. And I think there is something in here that, as I said, the strategic workforce planning was the #1 initiative that HR teams say is important to their future success for 2026. And part of that, I think, is maybe some of the stalling in the story around skills being something that enables a great employee experience. I think what the strategic workforce planning, the strategic workforce intelligence story enables us to do is link to that future of work, say, so where should we be sourcing our talent? Is that in Europe? Is it in India? Is it in the US? Where do those skills, where are they clustered within our organization? If we haven't got those skills, do we source buy them externally? Do we up-rate them and develop people internally? All this comes down into that strategic workforce intelligence, and that is maybe a significant pivot for many of the providers. If I pick out people like TechWolf and Glow, amongst others, are pushing in that direction because it enables you to have a much more strategic conversation as an HR team with your business. And again, that's one thing that's never gone away in our HR realities survey. The #1 driver or #1 objective for HR is to be a strategic business partner. And I think that strategic workforce planning, strategic workforce intelligence is a way of moving HR's debate away from how many people work for us and how many are paid into how do we enable the organization that we need tomorrow. And that's a really significant move. The other side of this is just in terms of employee engagement and trying to create a total people intelligence superpower almost. This is how engaged our people are. This is how well they are performing. This is the capability. And the missing link, and something that many organizations are chasing, is the connection then into business data. So there's a holistic view. Again, what we've seen historically is actually, even within the cloud HR platforms, they've not really joined those stories together. But HR as influencer needs strong data, and it needs strong stories out of its data. And that's something that actually has been weakly served by the wider HR industry overall, but it's a huge opportunity as you start to join external data with internal data and business data. So I'll wrap up there. Maybe that's a point to take a breath and a cup of tea, maybe. But David, I'm sure there's something else you want to add in there. I think I've ticked off all my list.
No, I was going to say, I think everybody on the call now knows why we limit you to 4. Of course, you could have 5 if you could keep them to one line as well. But anyway, that's the thing. So no, I mean, I think that's a really, really good overview of a whole set of confluence, if you like, of a whole different set of factors. I think the other point I would add on the HCM one is the other reason it's now disrupting the disruptors is where it's struggled to replicate the technology or the fidelity of the details. It's obviously acquiring, right? We've seen that recently. SAP acquisition of Smart Recruiters, obviously, which is more TA focused. Workday's acquisition of Paradox as a specialist within AI and recruiting, and then obviously Sana as AI in learning, and also the announcements they made around AI is the new UI. That's the kind of catchphrase from Workday Rising last week in Europe. So I think there's a lot of those trends. I think the other comment is, as you can considerably see, so HCM originally disrupted the talent suites more, I think, and arguably with obviously SAP became an HCM from being a talent suite. And then it's pretty clear that it's also now starting to impact on the specialists as well. And the use case, I think, sometimes for a complex ecosystem has become more challenging, despite the fact that there's probably incremental value in the specialists, right? So I think it's a really interesting space at the moment in terms of how things are changing, and I think companies are definitely re-looking at the complexity of their HR ecosystem, and at the same, they're trying to do two things. One is simplify and consolidate. Pushed a lot by IT, of course, to save costs, save integrations, and so on. At the same time, they've got to deliver more value, more impact, and be more agile, be faster, be more AI led, be more skills led, and so on and things like this. So these things are kind of slightly in contradiction, and somehow you've got to reform that. So I think there's a potential for quite a lot of change coming up going forward for a lot of organizations as well. And the specialists have got to work harder, I think, to retain their leadership around the specialism. But if you look at the 9 grid and strategic leaders zone, we're trying to everybody not to fixate on that, but the majority of the players up in the top right of this are specialists, right? And they still they are dominating especially at large enterprise, a lot of that conversation in terms of the way companies are feeling about it. And arguably even companies like Cornerstone, have retained maybe more of a leadership position because of the acquisition of companies like Skyhive and Edcast maybe before that, and so on and things like that. Again, specialists. So I think it's kind of an interesting space. But I think we should probably get onto questions, because I'm sure that's the reason most people come.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, David. So yeah, do put your questions in the chat pane there. Set it to everyone and ask both the analysts your questions. I just want to pick up on something, David. Perring, first of all, you talk a lot about the skills-based organization. It seems like the narrative is becoming more about the task-based tasks, as you say. Is this just a semantic thing? It seems like people might find talking about AI a little bit more understandable if you give it tasks rather than tell it to embody skills. I don't know if you've got any comments there.
Going back to the HR reality stuff that we're hopefully pushing out next week, 87% of organizations say they want to be skills-based organizations. And that's it shows you the groundswell of almost groupthink of skills has a logic in defining capability. And what I think we've started to see different organizations, they started to execute that, is understand that there's a few things that drive a richer experience, both for the organization and the employees and their workers and their managers. And one is the fidelity of skills. So understanding that a particular skill, and we use maybe it's Java programming is one of the favorite ones that we go back to, is knowing what version that is and where it is, and the context of that is a defining influencer on what projects that person gets put on. So if you have broader definitions of skills, then it becomes hard to do some of the actual short-term workforce planning. So even just in executing a skills-based organization from that side, it becomes hard. But even understanding the proficiency of somebody's skills is another layer of granularity, which helps you understand actually what learning is appropriate to enable you to grow that skill. So skills-based organizations, even within that, trying to break down more granularity, you have to do that if you want to understand proficiency, you want to understand capability, and you want to assign people to genuine work. The reason for looking at tasks is really ultimately it's the right maybe definition of work. When we think about work and we talk to the business around what work gets done, they will break it down into tasks. And going back to what I said earlier, the sense of when AI comes along, it does not do a skill, it completes a task. And in doing so, that reshapes your work. When half of what you do in terms of tasks disappear, that means that you've either got half your day to be twiddling your thumbs or to be applying yourself in a different way with which you work. And know that as an individual, you'll be applying different skills to those tasks. Now, some of those tasks, to some extent, you need less skill to do because the AI has done all the mathematic calculation and given you an answer, perhaps. but you still need to have some critical thinking in there. So it changes the focus of skills within your organization. So AI takes away tasks reshapes work. In doing that work, people need different sets of skills to complete the work. And it gives you a different profile of people who need to work in your organization. So probably thinking about tasks as being the critical building block in understanding how work changes because of AI and what the future of work looks like is where lots of the organizations, and I'll probably pick out Rejig as being one of the initial leaders in that. Siobhan from Rejig did a lot of work around pushing the idea that actually the right granularity to understand work is through tasks, and then that rolls on into skills once you understand what tasks you need to do.
David, anything to add?
Oh, you've gone onto silent.
You're on mute.
I echo the point. I've got two forms of mute, obviously. Is that it's the foundation of work, right? So, skills help to determine the capability to do it, but not what it is. And I think the more that we start to think about that holistically in both senses, and it's really critical because a key thing that AI is doing in terms of companies sort of evaluating what that future of work and the future of the workforce is determining what work, what activities, what tasks can be done by AI better, and rethinking maybe the way that we approach doing that, as well as, so that's when we start talking about augmenting humans, right? That's what we're doing. We're working out what bits that AI can do better and do faster. And then ultimately then trying to redefine the tasks and the activities that we think the people have. And obviously by doing that, we also redefine the skills they need in order to do those tasks as well. So it's pretty foundational for it, but it's also absent from a lot of, I would say, core HR models. And I think the other thing is looking at efficacy and outcomes when you're looking at tasks is a lot easier to do than it is necessarily when you're looking at skills. So therefore, from when you start thinking about how we calibrate, David talked about proficiency, for example, on skills is a notoriously difficult thing to be able to do objectively, and arguably the most important evidence that we need to assess proficiency and skill is actually what the outcomes of what people have done is, what the output they've created and what tasks they've completed and how successfully they did it. So almost the best evidence base is basically measures of work and work effectiveness, not measures of, what training courses you've done or what you said on your resume and all those kind of things. But it's a very important part of the concept model.
Yeah.
Everybody's very quiet on chat. I'm trying to encourage people to ask questions.
Maybe
they're still asleep from
me going on too long. Apologies.
Thanks, David. I've got another question around, well, this is more of a prediction question, David Perring. I don't know if you like doing this or not, but where do you see the market going? It's increasingly AI enabled from every single element of the whole process. So where do you see it all going? And we're obviously doing a lot of research specifically into AI across the 5 segments, but how does that, putting a TPS lens on it, talent, people, success, sorry for the internal acronym there, lens on it, what do you think about that, where it might be going?
Yeah, I'd go back to our HR realities research and just pick out that strategic workforce planning. I think that's a significant move, right? We know that from our latest research, 7% of organizations actually have strategic workforce planning live. And typically in the past, that's all been about how do we resource ourselves for the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, right? And we know that's been almost the operational sense of what strategic workforce planning is. But as we start to look out into the future and try to predict what our organization needs to have in terms of its resourcing, be that AI and people, then actually that creates quite some interesting dissonance, right? Creates some quite interesting turbulence. We know from even just only asking HR, 70% of HR think a third of what they could do or do today could be automated by 2030 and still be as effective. So what are HR going to do with that third of their time? right? So that is the question that applies to HR, but you can scale that out across any function. And then you're thinking about, so what teams do we have doing what, where, to what level of expertise do we have that necessary? What new things are we doing? And that sense of future prediction from HR to take it back and challenge their business to say, well, if this is where we want to go, and these are the choices we're going to make, our workforce is not ready. Do we buy? Do we grow that capability? How do we transition from where we are today as an organization into the organization that is fit for the future tomorrow? And I think that is a really significant maneuver for HR to be that strategic business partner, the strategic influencer. As I said, only 7% have got that live. It's the number one priority for 2026. So I think that's almost safe ground to almost see HR wanting to be more strategically influencing, wanting to be a stronger partner, taking the data rather than opinion, and the level of fidelity that people can get now around the capability, not only of that internal workforce, but the external workforce that they don't have, that they might want to hire on a regional basis, the ability to go into any organization which is significant sized and say, how ready are they for AI? What is my opportunity to beat them in the race? This data exists through large language models and the ingestion of loads of job advert data and LinkedIn profile data and employee data and a host full of data, which is enabling HR maybe to be a more purposeful advocate for the future of the organization and offer more strategic challenges to the C-suite than it's ever done before. So I think that's a significant sort of shift, and that's where I probably see lots of this going. But increasingly, I think on the other side of that, HR as a function, I think we're going to see a lot more of HR process ownership devolved down to managers, because the ability to have an expert give a manager advice about how they increase their employee engagement, increase the skills capability, resolve issues within their team by linking it to the employee listening, for example, is significantly higher than HR could stand on their own. And I think you can almost start to cut out the middleman on some of these processes. So I think we're going to see a significant downsizing on HR over the next 3 to 5 years as some of these processes start to bite in a little bit more. And that means HR need to think differently about being a transactional function into a transformational function. So those are two things that I'd pick out. Hopefully that sort of covers a little bit of the skills and a little bit of the employee engagement side as well.
Thanks, David. Before I come on to your question, Stefan, thank you very much for it. David Wilson, anything to add to what David said?
Well, actually, I was gonna interrupt with a question for David again, right? Which is because I think sometimes we're obviously looking at this a lot in large organizations, where they're using the solutions almost at the top of the 9-grid. I think the other question that's relevant to this is, how does this affect the wider kind of wider class of organization, mid and smaller corporates, not so much necessarily SMB, but more in the sort of the smaller mid enterprise space. Because one of the things that's interesting, sort of reflecting on the 9-grid, is actually there's quite a big distribution of the vendors across, but it feels like it's very top heavy in lots of ways, not just top right, but top heavy rather than top. And in many of the 9-grids, there's the mid band is really overpopulated with companies, very hard. There's lots of players there. It's very competitive, and it feels like although that there's a bit of a bifurcation going on within the market to some degree, where a lot of the specialist solutions are very much aiming at the top end of the market. But what about the mid and the lower band, for example, within the 9-grid?
Yeah, I think that if I look at it from two sides, one being the skills capability side and then the employee listening side, I think on the skills side, actually the ability of larger organizations almost to be resourced to embrace a new way of working, new thinking, and deployment of new systems has made it easier for them to gain traction. And it's almost that sort of early adopter curve. I think some of those large organizations have maybe had both more flex in their internal resourcing as an L&D team, or sorry, an HR team, but also maybe a few more burning platforms in terms of trying to move that mothership and do quite a turn on something that is slower moving. But I think there is something about the scale of the organization makes it easier to scale up. And that's probably been the true story over the last 4 or 5 years. More recently, I think we're starting to see skills, as long as you're not too precious about the definition of the ontology, becoming increasingly accessible to mid-sized organizations. So I think that's something that we're seeing almost evolve within the marketplace. It's almost the early adopters pushed the boundaries, tested and proved it. And as the top tiers start to stretch their muscles with the bigger players, because that's where they want to get their revenue, as those have started to sort of flatten out a little bit, actually it's the mid-tier which probably offers the most opportunity, and the AI is to some extent enabling some of that. Even some of the smaller players, I'll pick out Staff Circle as an example, they've started to pick out skills and offer a really interesting combination of skills and employee listening at a smaller scale aligned to performance as well. So it's becoming maybe something that was the reserve of larger organizations, but that tide is turning and it's becoming something that's much more accessible than it's ever been. I think on the employee listening side, they've always been something that mid-sized organizations have been able to buy into if they're at the right scale to want to know the culture of the organization as it moves from being maybe that's something that's a small business beyond the span of control and the eyes and the ears of people sort of almost within comprehension. And I mean that just in terms of, you know what it's like when you walk into an office and actually everybody in the office is only one office. You know what it feels like and you get the vibe instantly. As you start to see that maybe beyond the immediate sensing, actually you do need to have employee listening. And again, I think one of those areas, what maybe the interesting thing about that employee listening side is it's easy to scale that back in a smaller organization. And I think within those environments, some of the functionality isn't so much of a stretch. It's not as though you're trying to do something new. What ends up happening within those employee listening, employee engagement platforms is the functionality almost appears organically within the platform itself. And that means you're not necessarily implementing something new. It becomes something that's just part of the ambient software. So I think that's becoming more accessible. But maybe in the past, it was about the differentiators for large organizations. I think those are starting to scale down. I think there's lots of organizations in that 5,000 employee base who are becoming increasingly interested in, so how do we need to transform as an organization, and what can these sorts of solutions enable me to do that?
Interesting. I think the other thing I was going to say to that is there's probably also more suites within that thing, because I mean, recognizing particularly if you look across, you've so Headlight, Lattice, Calidus, Leapsome, Bridge maybe as well, Umantis, in Switzerland. There are probably more surviving suites there, whereas at the top of the market, again, it was dominated by a few like mega suites, and then it's really got very disrupted, I think. So
yeah, that's a good observation. I think some of it comes down to the ability of those small organizations to actually execute many systems, and that becomes probably one of the most critical constraints. And that's maybe, again, that's sort of going back to the HR HCM platforms disrupting the disruptors. I think it's difficult to see how the cloud HR platforms aren't increasingly going to stretch into some of the specialist areas, just because it becomes easier for them to almost follow the model. And that's why I think we're seeing some of those specialist players, I pick out Fuel 50, like Castnia, Brain, TechWolf, Glow, Rejig. I think that's why they're pivoting into things that the cloud HR platform still can't do around strategic workforce planning and that future of work story. They haven't got a strong story there, and populating that is one of the challenges for all organizations. So again, it's I think a super interesting time.
Thank you, David.
Cool.
Just before we move on, a question from Stefan.
Yep.
We're going back to tasks briefly. He asks,
Yeah.
is it from tasks we derive which skills are needed to define the skills-based organization?
Yes. And I
There we
think
go.
that's one of the almost slight missteps. I think it's ultimately, I think, because of the AI has been doing most of the grunt work on defining skills and skills ontologies, and there's loads of data around job descriptions and job families. People have got a pretty good definition of what skills people need to work in particular roles. And that's been something that the old way of doing things worked around. I think as we start to look at look at tasks, then it helps you create a stronger view of the future of work. And that helps you then calibrate what skills are relevant in the future of work. So it's probably that separation of skills for today. You can define that from your existing job descriptions. So if you want to define the organization of tomorrow, then you do need to say what work's going to get done. And that comes down to what tasks.
David,
Hope that answers your question, Stefan.
if you've got nothing to add, I might suggest we move on so we can talk a bit about the AI project. Yeah. So thank you for your questions. This is just the start, as we say. Do find out more about corporate membership through the QR code you can see there, as well as Fosway's accelerated buying support for aligning stakeholders, validating solution strategy, vendor options, and de-risking buying decisions. But if we move on to the next slide, let's spend a little bit of time talking about the AI project as well, which actually I don't see on the presentation there, but I don't think we need many prompts about it. David Wilson, can we talk about the AI project phase 2, which is coming in 2026?
Yeah, so I mean, some of you will be aware of some of the material we pushed out in the summer onwards, late July onwards, which was some of the results from our AI kind of strategic research project that we kicked off actually this time last year, pretty much. And we started to put out, as well as some of the realities data around AI, but also starting to put out things around the things called our AI market assessments, where we were doing analysis around effectively how real or hypey was the AI story from most of the vendors. And with some very interesting results, and one of the things that we're in the process of doing, so we're hopefully just about to publish the results of that for TPS, so that normally we're trying to make that follow the 9 grid fairly soon. So hopefully you'll see that within the next couple of weeks or so. We published the one for Cloud HR fairly recently, and the kind of conclusion from this is obviously that there isn't actually much that's mainstream in the market, and that but there's a lot of stuff that's in the coming next kind of cycle. There's also massive differentiation between the vendors. So even though everybody is now an AI first vendor, there's a lot of differentiation around the level of how extensive their roadmap and the vision is around AI, and also how advanced they are in actually delivering any of it. We're about to go into phase 2 of that project, where we're going to drill into this again. We're going to be doing updated market assessments, but even more significantly, we're really trying to drill into around adoption and value. So it's not just a question of what are the vendors producing, but who's using it, and are corporates turning it on or off, and where are they actually seeing real value? So there's an opportunity particularly on the corporate side, if companies are interested in that. It's very detailed, granular project, but there's a huge amount of value and insight that's already coming from this, and challenging, I think, the market, both in terms of the speed of transition and also in terms of the value that they're really delivering. So if you're interested in that, please reach out, obviously on the corporate side, particularly to Jack, who's on the call here, who can and find out a bit more about how to get involved in that. You will see some public research layers for that in terms of trying to cross-validate the whole vendor side of the story. But we're also, we've run a lot of roundtables around AI. We've also we'll be doing some deep inquiry with core participants from the corporate side as well to do it. We're also looking potentially about building some more things like strategic blueprints and things like trying to help companies understand how to focus investment. It's a very complex topic, and there's lots of elements to it, and many of those are actually outside, of course, the HR function. IT's got its own view about how you're going to do AI and so on. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of activity there.
Anything to add, David? Excuse me, Mr. Perring.
I just think it's really interesting, Tom, as David said, primarily because I think in terms of how you pace and build your HR ecosystem is really hotting up. And if you want to, as an HR team, get some differential or differentiating functionality, which enable you to be more of a strategic business partner, drive more transformation with your business, help your organization transition more successfully into the future of work. Many of those solutions are in play now. They are available. They may not still be available in 3 or 4 years' time from maybe your existing incumbent providers. So there is some really strong niche plays that give your business an advantage. And I think there are certain choices that if you delay will damage you as an HR team in 2 or 3 years' time, because you need to act now in order to be the leader, the influencer. And I think that's a real big challenge around how you stitch this together. Even the cloud HR platforms haven't managed to integrate all of their data together to create a meaningful intelligence view. If you want to get something a bit more differentiating, sometimes you have to play with the specialists.
Thanks. So yes, that's it for today. Just remains for me to thank both of our speakers for going through this latest 9 grid. We have realities research coming out, and we've got plenty more for 2026. Look out for the recording of this session. It'll appear on the Fosway website as well as our YouTube channel, and we will see you all on the next one. Thanks for today. See you very soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, John.
So